I'm very, very happy that we are kicking off the second day with a great expert and great insights into the three pillars that we're talking about. And I can think of nobody better placed to speak about power, protection, and participation than Sasha Havlicek. She's the founding CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a partner of the Political Tech Summit. We're very grateful for that. And Sasha has made a way to Berlin to speak to us today. She's a policy entrepreneur, an expert who's advising government, who's a regular commentator on the world's media. And we're very happy to hear from her about the state of the world, about the state of power, protection, and participation. Damian Collins, who you already know from yesterday, will be chairing the session. Sasha will start, kick us off with some thoughts and remarks, and then Damian will interview her and, of course, also allow some questions. Sasha, a warm welcome to Berlin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to see all of you. We're so impressed. Damien and I were just saying that in the UK, you would never get this kind of showing on a Saturday morning for any topic, specifically not politics and tech, but it's wonderful to see all of you. We thought that it would be painful to put you through a half-an-hour speech, so we thought we'd mix it up a little bit, and I'm hoping that we can have an interactive conversation and discussion, and so Damien and I are going to have a conversation, a little chat. I did want to start, I mean, this is a big topic, by the way, to give somebody for, again, a Saturday morning. Power, protection, participation. I wanted to start with perhaps the obvious, which is that the levels of protection that we're afforded, citizens, protection from harms of different kinds, but also the protections that we see in place for our rights, our freedoms, and the participation, the quality and the levels, the extent of participation that we see across society is a direct function of the checks and balances we put in place on power. That is the basic premise, the basic principle of a liberal democracy. It is also just the basic premise and principle of good governance. On both of those fronts, we're really struggling today. And so I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit about what do checks and balances look like in a way that get us to a place that we are not dealing at scale with the kinds of harms that my organization works on. So let me just say a couple of words about who I am, what we do at ISD, and I've got some of my colleagues here. ISD for now 20 years has been at the forefront of work at the intersection of public safety, national security, and democracy with technology, because, of course, the digital information ecosystem sits at the very, very heart of the way in which all of our nefarious bad actors wishing to do us harm operate. And I'll give you just a sense of the kinds of things that we look at day in, day out. We're doing this kind of continuous, real-time threat detection and monitoring with a fairly advanced digital analytics and OSINT investigative capability. So we're constantly in those spaces where we're seeing ISIS and AQ, neo-Nazi and other forms of terrorist and violent extremist groups radicalize, recruit, operationalize their activity. We're constantly in those environments that are now increasingly exposed to sexploitation, where minors are exploited by those types of criminal networks, where we see nihilistic death cults increasingly active and engaging with those youth subcultures online, where we see school shooter fandoms increasingly engage with kids in many of these environments. Those subcultures are rife with these kinds of exploitation and recruitment activities. And then we do a lot of work on totalitarian states' interference in our societies. Mass manipulation is the name of the game. And they've been extremely effective. I know that there was a presentation yesterday on exactly that topic, but we're in the process, in the job of trying to expose those types of information and cyber operations that are really seeking to divide us, and to tilt the playing field around elections, to tilt the playing field around major political issues of our time. Sorry, I will just admit to you that I'm using my son's iPad this morning because mine broke. And I consistently have little requests for parental, screen time stuff popping up on my screen for a ton of apps that he's downloaded that he's not meant to have. This is like now I'm just, so this is where I am now really quite at the forefront of these problems. And so yes, can I become... Yeah, age restriction stuff is not working for me at this point in time. So much for my expertise on digital safety. Anyway, but I wanted to say, I suppose, having been in the nether regions of the internet for a very long time, looking at these types of threats, and not just analyzing them, but really looking to find operational and policy solutions to these. I think there are three things that really stand out for us, for me, when I think about this track record of our work over the 20 years. What we've come to understand over time is that actually, while the internet offered us up this immense opportunity for democratization, for the free flow of information, something that we should all wish to protect, the business model that has come to dominate of social media, the attention economy business model, has in fact ended us in a situation where we are no longer experiencing a level playing field for the free and fair competition of ideas. The free and fair competition of ideas sits at the heart of all, of course, of our democracies and their functioning. This is not what we experience online. These are not free speech environments. These are curated speech environments. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've seen in relation to some of the systematic sort of algorithmic distortions and harms, whether it's the serving up to some of the most susceptible and vulnerable users of some of the most dangerous, potentially dangerous types of content, or the kind of gaming of the algorithmic systems by hostile states. Increasingly, we're seeing that gaming transferred also into the AI space, and that kind of grooming of AI LLMs is something, again, I think we should be really, really concerned about as we move forward, as we should be about the potential tilting of the entire AI economy into this attention economy business model, and something that we need to be really aware of. So I'd love to have a little conversation about what that means and how do we secure a real, a real free speech environment in the online universe today. That's something we've given a lot of thought to. I want to say two other things. We have to acknowledge that systematic threats, harassment, intimidation, this is something we see a lot, the kind of thing that actually is illegal in the real world. We see waged at scale, and we see that turn into violence in the real world, but we also see that as a massive silencing tactic. So we see big swathes of the population, whole communities, being essentially intimidated out of our public square. But we also see politicians at scale. When we look at the kind of rate of harassment and abuse, I'm looking at Alexandra Geza here, who knows this very well, unfortunately firsthand, but the systematic abuse, for instance, of female public figures and politicians is so extraordinary that we are now seeing in all of the polling and all of the research, certainly, that we've done, many women simply not want to return into that public sphere. And this is happening, of course, for many other constituencies, judges, I mean, women and minorities in all different kinds of public roles. So I want to leave it there just to say we've got to do something about what I think over time have become essentially weapons of mass manipulation. Where we want freedom, we ultimately are getting manipulation. And these weapons of mass manipulation, if you are now looking at the onset of AI, could in fact become weapons of mass destruction. So this is no longer something that we can debate in these nice fora for long periods of time. The urgency that faces us, I think, is absolutely plain to see. So maybe we start off with that, and over to you, Damien. Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Right. Yes. I think that's. Thank you so much, Sasha. And I think that's a really good place to start the discussion, because I often hear people who are free speech campaigners say that they've always believed that, there are good ideas and there are bad ideas, and the way you beat bad ideas is to have more good ideas. But what we see on digital platforms, particularly social media platforms, is that the volume of disinformation, hate speech, is being amplified by external bad actors gaming the systems, but also the platforms themselves will push content that is gaining traction and building an audience and push it at people. So there's that problem. And then I think alongside that, a second problem that in some ways I think we use the term social media, and I think that really describes what it was 10 years ago. Actually, most of the experience of people now is not so much creating content that they share and discuss with their friends, but is being fed. I mean, they are literally called feeds. People are being fed content that's being pushed at them.
I mean, let me give you a couple of examples of this, just from some of our research. But we've got, just reams of this analysis from over the many years of doing this. We've just done a piece of research that's not yet been published, but will be, with a partner, the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust in the UK, that shows that a 15-year-old boy in the UK interested in male lifestyle influencers only needed to be on TikTok for 1 hour before being served anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. A 15-year-old boy in the UK also interested in left-wing politics only needed to spend an hour and a half on TikTok before being served Hamas content. And videos that glorified the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's just one tiny vector within which this kind of thing is happening, where people are sort of being driven to ever more weird, extreme things. But not just that, they're being served off stuff that they otherwise were not looking for. I mean, this is, I think, the thing that I find most egregious. Why? Why does some kid with left-leaning impulses, and interests, get served up this kind of stuff? Coming to ISIS, I mean, it's quite amazing because, many people think that this is, a done deal, but we found now systematic, engagement with ISIS on mainstream platforms, on Meta, at scale. We've just now found, just this month, we've got, Islamic State supporters with over 10,000 followers on Facebook in one place, generating more than 350,000 views in just 1 month's period. This is prescribed terrorist content. This is full-on illegal stuff. So and then again, that stuff was again being algorithmically pushed to kids. So we were seeing that anybody engaging with stuff in that vicinity was then algorithmically served up that content. That thing is happening across so many vectors. The rise in youth radicalization, in minors radicalization, whether to nihilistic death cults, we've gone from Black Lives Matter to White Lives Matter to No Lives Matter. Whether it's ISIS, whether it's neo-Nazi engagement, the kids being driven into these spaces is, at a scale that we've never seen, and the age is coming down. We now have referrals to, our counter-terrorism program in the United Kingdom of people, kids 8 years old, 9 years old. I mean, this is where we are. And then, we see this across, again, some of the, the stuff that's being served up to girls on self-harm, boys on, we know the whole thing.
I found sort of, certainly my time in the House of Commons, if you're speaking, certainly towards the end of that time, when you're speaking to a group of, let's say, school children aged sort of 14 or 15, or university students in their first year, if you talk to them on the basis that boys have been targeted with pornography, and girls have been targeted with self-harm content, you can see all the faces in the room nodding at the appropriate points. They won't talk about it, and in some ways they feel they can't talk about it because they'd get into trouble if they did. But nevertheless, that is their lived experience, and they're not seeking this content out.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, at the very least, a serious conversation about how we protect minors. But remember, this is happening at all ages. And it's happening in the political terrain as well. And I know that there was a conversation about election integrity yesterday, but I'll just give you a snippet of part of our research from this last German election, looking at, for instance, TikTok's feed. And we found that AfD content accounted for 49%. It's nearly half of the first 5 political posts across feeds. I mean, we'd love to understand better whether that's an algorithmic issue. And again, I will come back to now this final real challenge for us is it definitely suggests that. Without the kind of data access for third parties to be able to evaluate at scale the algorithmic outcomes of these kinds of feeds that we see, we're never going to really comprehensively understand what's happening here. But the black box and the increasing, and I think to add insult to injury, what we've really seen in this recent sort of 3 to 5 year period is that platforms have been progressively shuttering access to data for journalists, for third-party researchers. It is in nobody's interest for that to be the case, because on the one hand, you have organizations like ours that are doing actual threat detection to be able to prevent online threats from materializing into offline violence often, but also distortions around elections and other things. And at the same time, if you are worried about bias at scale, whether you sit on the left or the right or whichever loony end of the spectrum you might be, you should be concerned about not having access to that data. Because you're right to say, okay, I think this is biased against me. Well, maybe, but you have no way of finding that out right now. And all we want, and I think this is where liberal democracies have one clear avenue for response to these kinds of harms. Where authoritarian states go for censorship, we have to do the diametric opposite. We have to mandate transparency. We have to be able to say, okay, we're going to get under the bonnet of this and understand, is there a systemic bias of these algorithmic pushes?
One of our major allies basically wants to close down any discussion of this topic.
Well, I would just say so much for free speech. I mean, if we can't even put on the table what we believe the threats to be and have an open conversation about it, yes, we're in trouble. And what I would again say, we need an open, we need an untilted, an environment which isn't essentially tipped in the interest of one view or another. Yeah. We've got to have an environment where we can have an open, fair debate about these things. And I will just say on that Russian thing, there's so much evidence, obviously, that's been investigated by many governments, by many non-governmental organizations around not just Russian, but CCP, Iranian information cyber operations. It's very clear, the evidence on that front. The shift now, and there are billions of dollars being spent by these governments in what is a cheap vehicle to mass manipulation, but they are spending billions nonetheless. And our recent piece of research on LLM grooming is fascinating. We did find across 4 major chatbots that, in fact, when asked about Ukraine, about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, they were largely, 20% of the responses were essentially Russian talking points from prescribed Russian public media outlets. Yeah. Yeah. And the investment in that more sort of dark hand side of manipulating the public square, I think is absolutely critical for us to understand more than ever now, with the potential of manipulating the outputs of LLMs. Yes. We've got to go for transparency.
Absolutely. And I think I've seen some reports that estimate that nearly up to 40% of global internet traffic is driven by bots, false accounts, which are boosting content. And we were talking about earlier, I mean, some may be aware of the kind of, I'd say he's far-right populist Nick Fuentes, whose posts get bigger traffic on X than Elon Musk's do. and given the system is basically designed to give Elon Musk the biggest voice, that would suggest there's something industrial going on to amplify his message.
Well, so when Elon first took over X, Twitter, it was interesting because the first thing he said was, we've got to deal with the bot problem, and we've got to deal with the algorithm problem. And then we'll do better on free speech. And I'd agree, absolutely. If you can actually address the inauthenticity problem, which is massive. By the way, I think it's a little bit of a problem from just an advertising standpoint. I think, many of your companies might be in the advertising sector, but I don't know if you really want to be paying to advertise to bots. Aren't we paying to advertise to humans? Yeah. But, that's a massive, massive problem.
I think that's right. And I think in terms of the a bit like getting Al Capone for tax evasion. I think, it's if platforms are selling bot accounts as real people to advertisers with no transparency over the data, that's fraud, basically.
Correct. But in addition to that, we've talked about how, the algorithmic design in relation to this attention economy tends to push people, in a sense, agnostically to whatever, the extreme variance of whatever it is that they're looking for. That's, I think, been the experience that we've seen over the last many years. But I do worry now that we're seeing something potentially new, which is the actual politicization. When power is held by so few at the very top of our public square, I mean, the risk of political bias intentionally is enormous. And of course, we've seen statements to the effect. And how much of that then is understood by users is a massive challenge for us. And I don't think there's any one silver bullet for this, but I do think that we do need, all of us together to come around this, challenge. And I do think, thinking about this from the perspective of the information life cycle, if you like, from production and everything we can do around sort of bad actors and the kinds of, interventions of, foreign states and terrorist organizations. Well, there's much more that all parts of society can do in relation to understanding the intentions and the tactics of those bad actors. And governments need to do more about that. Society needs to do more about that. Then there's the piece of that informational content lifecycle, which is to do with distribution and the kind of amplification models that we see in place. And here again, I think there's more that well-intentioned engineers, thank you, and designers should be thinking about how they do this right, because we've all got something to gain from that. There's better ways for us to do that. And then, of course, we're all consumers. And we've got to do better in upping, the game in terms of how we consume as a population, not just kids, but adults as well. And we do a lot of work with businesses to try and get adults better educated as to how this online ecosystem works, how your data is being used, why do you see something different to your neighbor, how is this distorting your information environment? These are things that we can all come together to educate.
Yeah. I think we've just got a couple of minutes left, so if there are any sort of questions in the room, anything people would like to ask Sasha before we wrap up, if not, I guess you'll be around for a bit, so people can approach you.
On transparency, when you spoke about platforms shutting off data, we've seen companies like Meta conduct really shady internal research with really questionable methodological, unjustified methods overall. Do you think we can trust them to conduct this research in the first place, and we can trust their findings to begin with?
I personally don't think anybody should mark their own homework. I think these are basic principles that we apply to most of society. So I would really like to see, the only way I think we get to where we need to be is creating an ecosystem of scrutiny, where we, again, open up the black box, provide data access. And again, this isn't about trade secrets. It's not providing access to the actual algorithm, none of that stuff. Of course not. Not trade, not IP. But really being able to make sure that whatever perspective you come from, you're able to scrutinize what's happening fairly, and we can have a public debate about it.
Yeah, one, probably take a final question over there at the back.
Thank you so much for this. We've seen some efforts, for example, by the governments of Canada, Australia, to ban social media for youth under age 14. In your opinion, do you think this is an effective use of our effort if we want to focus on this aspect of protection of our youth? Do you think it'll have kind of these intended outcomes of protecting youth, or is this something that we should go in a different direction with?
So as the mother of a 14-year-old that's downloading shit that he shouldn't be downloading, I will say, go for it. But it shouldn't stop there. And I would just say, bans, the problem with bans is that they can be circumvented quite a bit, and I worry about that. So I don't want that to be the end of the story. I think all of the things that we've just talked about now in terms of the systems we need in place for transparency and accountability are absolutely critical. And again, the over-concentration of power, whether in the market or indeed in our information ecosystem, is extremely dangerous. It leads ultimately to authoritarianism. And authoritarians really understand this very, very well. They know that it is in the shaping of our digital information ecosystem that the battle between liberal democracy and authoritarianism is taking shape. People who are concerned about freedom, individual rights, about democracy, need to understand that we have to shape it in our image, which is transparency and accountability. That's where I would land.
A question is also a brilliant lead into the next session as well, so hold that thought. But Sasha, thank you very much.
Thank you.